Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be showing you how to fly traffic patterns with the A310. Right off the bat, you might be wondering why you would want to do this with a wide-body airliner in the first place, but the truth is that it can do wonders for your skills hand flying the airplane on short final, especially when there's less than ideal conditions with a lot of wind or bad weather. It's also a ton of fun to fly an airliner this way, and if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to keep watching and let's get going. I'm starting on runway 26 left in Vancouver for this one, just so that I can streamline things a little bit. You could start at the gate if you prefer and taxi out to the runway, but just for practice like this, I don't really see the point. And you can also use whatever airport you want as well. I'm using Vancouver, but you can pretty much use anything. Now, a traffic pattern in an airliner is a little bit different than what you would do with a general aviation airplane. And for starters, I'm going to be going up to 2,000 feet instead of the standard 1,000 feet. Once I've got a little bit of altitude under me, I'm going to start my turn to the crosswind leg, although what I tend to do is to just continue that turn all the way onto downwind. Once I'm parallel to the runway and I am on the downwind leg, I'm going to very quickly stabilize the airplane, and shortly after that, once we're abeam the end of the runway, just like with a normal traffic pattern, we're going to start configuring for landing. The base turn comes about 1 minute past the abeam point of the runway, which is a little bit further than what you would do with a general aviation airplane, and that's where I'm going to start descending and slowing the airplane down to come around onto final and come back around and land. Now that you've got an idea how we're going to do this, let's set a few things up in the airplane for it. The first thing I'm going to do is go down to the box and go onto the init page, and I'm going to enter the from to. In this case, I'm going from Vancouver to Vancouver, so all I've got to do is enter CYVR/CYVR and just load it into the right field. The other details on this page aren't really important for what we're going to be doing for circuits, so I tend to just leave them blank. Next, I'm going to go to the flight plan page, and again, this is going to be super simple. I'm going to click on my departure airport, although this is kind of optional, and all I'm going to do is go into SID, and I'm going to pick my 26 left, which is my departure runway. I'm going to choose none for a departure because, again, I'm really just going to be taking off and turning right onto downwind. I'm going to insert that, and as you can see, it didn't really do anything in the flight plan. And I'm just going to click on my arrival airport this time, and I'm going to go into star. And now, again, I'm going to pick my arrival runway, which is the same one that I'm taking off from, which is 26 left. And I'm also going to put none for the star. Once I insert that, what you're going to see is that it's actually giving me an extended runway center line that I can use to align myself when I'm coming around on the base turn. I find this really useful because you're going to be a lot further out than you would be for a normal traffic pattern, and it just makes it a whole lot simpler to know when you should start turning final. There's only a couple more details to set up before takeoff, and for that I'm going to go to the EFB, go onto the weight and balance page, and I'm going to start filling out all the details. For the number of passengers, I usually only set about 10, whatever is easiest to do on the slider. I don't use any cargo, and I give myself about 20,000 pounds of fuel. Like that, I'll be able to go around the traffic pattern a good 3 or 4 times, either because I screwed something up and I have to try it again, or if I just want to practice and do another touch and go. With the plan applied to the aircraft, I can see that my CG is 28.2, so I'm going to go back to the box, go into the progress page, go into fuel prediction, and right here I'm going to type in 28.2 into the scratch pad, and I'm just going to load it into the CG field. I'm going to go back to the EFB now to calculate my V-speeds, although the only one that really matters for this type of flight is the rotation speed. So I'll go onto the airplane logo, and at that point I'm just going to pick all of the defaults for runway length and for runway heading. For the altimeter, I'm just going to enter 29.92 because I'm just using the default weather today for this test flight. And in terms of weight, I'm using the gross weight number that you can find on the weight and balance page, which is about 200,000 pounds, so I'll enter 200 here. That's calculated a V1 of 136 and a VR of 137, so I'm going to go back to the box one last time, go onto the takeoff approach page, and from there I'm going to enter those values for V1 and VR. It also calculated a V2 speed for me, but I'm actually not going to use that number. But either way, you don't enter it from here. I need to go onto the autopilot panel to do it, so I'm going to go there now. Now, instead of putting in 146 like it says, I'm actually going to use 200. That's the speed that I'm going to use to fly around the traffic pattern. I find it's a pretty good compromise between doing it too fast and not having enough time to react, and doing it a little bit too slow and it taking a little bit longer than it should. The next thing to set on the autopilot panel is the altitude, and like I said, we're going to be doing our traffic pattern at 2,000 feet, so I'll just dial that back down to 2,000 so that when I engage the autopilot, it'll level off automatically for me. The heading bug is already synced to my current heading for the runway, so I'm going to leave that as is, and very importantly, I'm going to arm the level change mode. It's going to make doing this the first few times you try it a lot simpler, because once you're airborne, you can just turn on the autopilot at that point, and it's going to automatically level off at your 2,000 feet, and it's going to maintain your 200 knots that you wanted to. If you were to use profile mode instead, at some point the profile mode is going to decide to accelerate to 250, and I really find that to be too fast for flying the traffic pattern. The last thing to do is to set the flaps to the first position, and at that point I am pretty much ready to go. We're going to get back to the video here in just a second, but I do want to remind you to hit the like button if you haven't already, and consider subscribing as well. I publish a new video every 2 weeks with tips, tricks, and tutorials for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and your support helps to keep the channel growing. The first part of the takeoff for this flight is pretty normal. I'm going to start by turning the parking brake off, spool the engines up to about 50%, and then I'm going to go to toga power. I'm going to make things easier for myself by enabling the auto throttle by just pressing the button on the left-hand side. But once you have a little bit of experience doing this, I really recommend doing it without the auto throttle and without the autopilot, just to increase the level of difficulty. Once I'm at rotation speed, I'm going to pull back on the stick and follow the flight director up to about 15 degrees of bank. I'll bring the gear up as soon as I've got a positive rate, but I'm going to leave the flaps in the first position for the entirety of this first part of the flight. To make this a little bit easier, you can enable the autopilot at this point as well. The level off altitude of 2,000 feet is going to come up really quickly in an airliner, and you can very easily blow right through it as well as your target airspeed. So you can do it all yourself, but I really think the first few tries, just use the autopilot to get used to it. It's already time to turn to the crosswind leg, and since the autopilot's on, all I've got to do is turn the heading bug by 90 degrees to do that, and the plane is going to be turning at standard rate turns, which is what we're going to be aiming for once I disable it in just a little bit. I tend to stay on the crosswind leg for 5, maybe 10 seconds max, because at 200 knots you can get really far from the airport really quickly, and even with an airliner you don't need to be that far off to fly your downwind leg. Things start to get really busy once the plane's rolled out on downwind, and the first thing I'm actually going to do is disable the auto throttle. To do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust my physical throttles on my controller to set it to about the same percentage as what it's reading in the N1 gauge. With that done, I'm going to disable it by just pressing the auto throttle button, and I'm also going to disable the autopilot at this point because I'm not really going to need it, and like that, I've got complete control of the airplane. At the same time as I'm doing all of this, I'm also keeping an eye on my position relative to the airfield. The downwind leg gets flown really fast at 200 knots, and you have to make sure that you see once you go by the beam point of the runway. At that point, what you've got to do is come down to the timer and just start it by pressing the white button on the bottom left, and you're going to see the little needle is going to start counting up. While it's counting up to 30 seconds, I'm just going to continue monitoring my airspeed, my altitude, and my heading. And also, don't forget to adjust for wind. Even a big airliner is going to get pushed around, so if it's blowing across either from left to right or right to left, you're going to have to crab slightly into it. Once the timer hits 30 seconds, that's when you're going to bring the gear down, and you're going to leave the flaps as is for now. The plane at this point is going to want to dip down a little bit, and that's because the gear coming down is going to cause a little bit of excess drag, and that's totally normal. All you've got to do is just add in a little bit of trim to compensate. At 60 seconds on the timer, I'm going to go to flaps 2, start my base turn, and I'm going to start descending at 500 feet per minute. I'm going to try and make a standard rate turn as much as possible, which is 25 degrees of bank. But most importantly, I need to make sure that my descent rate stays at that 500 feet per minute, because otherwise I'm going to end up too high on short final. As I get close to perpendicular with the runway is where I'm going to go to flaps 3, but I haven't made a throttle change yet. They're still sitting at around 60% N1, and the plane is slowing down nicely to my target airspeed of 160 by just extending the flaps. I'm also keeping an eye on the runway centerline in the distance so that I can line myself up properly for the turn to final, and I can also use the extended centerline that I set up on the navigation display to help me out with that. And as I start the last turn onto final, that's where I'm going to go to flaps 4, at which point I'm fully configured for landing. It takes a few tries to judge the turn to final properly, and it's very easy to overshoot the runway if you're not careful, but I only make small adjustments at this point because I've got plenty of time to fix it. Going to flaps 4 brought my speed down to close to 140, but I need to get to 120, 125 for my landing speed, so what I'm going to do is just reduce throttle a little bit to about 57%. Whatever you do, don't make big changes to the throttle at this point. These engines take a lot of time to spool up and to spool down, and it can take a good 10 to 15 seconds to see the effect of any change that you've made. You also need to be careful not to get too slow too fast, because you could end up with a stick shaker if you go below 120, which is close to the stall speed, and at that point the auto throttle is going to kick in automatically and you'll have no choice but to go around. At this point, it becomes very much like landing a general aviation airplane. You're making small power and pitch adjustments to stay on your descent rate, and you're making very small adjustments left or right to stay aligned with the center line. The landing I'm doing right now is almost in ideal conditions, but you can increase the difficulty level a fair bit by adding in more wind, a crosswind, or even a little bit of rain if you want, as long as the clouds aren't too low for you to be able to fly the pattern visually. This is really the time to be practicing all of these things so that once you come in after a long flight, you feel confident enough that you can disable the autopilot and still make the runway. As you get down to the ground, you can either choose to do a touch and go to have another try at it, but what I recommend, even if you do want to go around, is to actually come to almost a full stop, get off the runway, go around the taxiway back to the start of the runway, reset everything in the airplane, and do it again. It's a really high workload for a single pilot to reset the airplane as you're barreling down the runway for takeoff, but you can try either way, of course. And that should cover it for flying circuits with the A310. I hope you learned something useful in this video and that you feel a little bit more confident hand flying the A310 than you did at the beginning of the video. And if you got some value, please make sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing to get more similar content.